Hello everyone, my name is Vasiliou. I work at Catchpoint Systems, and we sell various synthetic, external synthetic monitoring and real user rum measurement tools. And like most companies, we're looking for the best and the brightest. Our sales office is here in New York, and engineering development is down in New York. And I think that is it for disclosures, unless I'm missing something. All right, let's begin. Now, even though the title of this presentation is the charts and graphs of web performance, you could really replace web performance with anything you're interested in measuring, right? This really is about charts and graphs and visuals. So whether it's web performance or ski times at the Olympics, or 40-yard dashes, whatever it is, but just kind of keep that in mind as we go through this. This really is a broader topic. Now, while I do have some opinions on these things, we can save those for some water cooler conversation afterward, but tonight's presentation is really about charts and graphs. And in the web performance arena, we're going to just cover some basic concepts, some just refreshes, some more popular, more well-known chart types, and then talk about some of the lesser-known use cases and areas, and then some of the different ways to present data for some of these other different use cases, right? And then for some reason there seems to be a bit of a buzz on competitive benchmarks, so I do intentionally spend a little bit of extra time talking about that in like the second half of the presentation, all right? So, kind of like the Big Bang, it all started with a scatter. There's nothing before the scatter, right? No raw log files we're prepping for anything. Like, this is where we're starting from. So, what we're going to do is we're going to take this chart and graph it about umpteen different ways through the presentation. So, what we've got here is 1 day's worth of website performance data, 24-hour period. There are about 3,500 individual test run data. Trust me, I counted them. And so you can see here maybe about 7 a.m. there was some type of what's called a pattern change, progressing through most of the day. And at 4 p.m. things kind of went back to normal, except that cluster of outliers in the top right. Now, do me a favor and just try to keep this in memory as we go through, as well as refer to the handout on this page as we kind of talk through the presentation here. Now, the other thing that's important, which I think is a key component to the presentation, is wherever you see that little mini version of the scatter in the bottom right-hand corner, that means that the larger chart on that screen was made from that same set of data. So very important concept as we go through. This is probably the most popular chart type. It's a time-based summary chart showing either the average or the median, depending on which calculation you want to use. Notice how, compared to the left side of the chart, that cluster of outliers is quote-unquote pulling up the overall average. It's an important concept. We'll revisit that in a little bit. But somebody came along and said, how about adding a bunch of other calculations like some percentiles. So the 99th percentile, for example, says 99% of that 3,500 data was equal to or below the 99th percentile. Whatever that number is on the y-axis there. Conversely, that means 1% of that 3,500 data was above the 99th percentile. And so the question then becomes, do the lines tell the whole story? So you might say on the left half of the chart, or maybe the left 3/4 of the chart, they kind of do, where maybe on the right side over here, we're missing out on an entire subset of a sample or population, and we're looking at this. And then when you overlay those percentiles, then maybe now the lines do start to tell the whole story. But how about this one? So, two things. First, pay homage to Dan and his talk last month on heat maps. But the other piece to this whole thing, the other reason that this slide is in here is because we need to kind of understand the general debate when it comes to visuals. and that is on one side of the coin, there are a group of people that say, present only the data, the dots and the lines, and that will be the best possible way for people to understand the data. However, the other side of the coin suggests that when you do things like make use of color and some of these other infographics, maybe people have heard that word recently, that it stimulates different parts of the brain, thus actually leading to a greater understanding of the data than if you were just presenting only the data. So basically you say chart junk versus no chart junk. At the end of last year, the folks at Harvard published a document. It's called What Makes a Visualization Memorable. And the reason I'm showing this is because we're actually going to talk through and just talk about some strategic use of color, but separately, what makes a visualization memorable. I recommend folks give it a read if you want to take a peek at it. Just to put these side by side, these are all created from the same chart data and instant pull. If you had to pick one of these four graphs as your default, who would go with number one only? You really replace web performance with anything you're interested in measuring, right? This really is about charts and graphs and visuals. So whether it's web performance or ski times at the Olympics or 40-yard dashes, whatever it is, but just kind of keep that in mind as we go through this. This really is a broader topic. Now, while I do have some opinions on these things, we can save those for some water cooler conversation afterward, but tonight's presentation is really about charts and graphs. And in the web performance arena, we're going to just cover some basic concepts, some just refreshes on some more popular, more well-known chart types, and then talk about some of the lesser-known use cases and areas, and then some of the different ways to present data for some of these other different use cases. Right? And then for some reason there seems to be a bit of a buzz on competitive benchmarks, so I do intentionally spend a little bit of extra time talking about that in like the second half of the presentation. All right? So, kind of like the Big Bang, it all started with a scatter. There's nothing before the scatter, right? No raw log files we're grabbing for anything. Like, this is where we're starting from. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this chart and graph it about umpteen different ways through the presentation. So what we've got here is 1 day's worth of website performance data, 24-hour period. There are about 3,500 individual test run data. Trust me, I counted them. And so you can see here maybe about 7 a.m. there was some type of what's called a pattern change, progressing through most of the day, and at 4 p.m. things kind of went back to normal, except that cluster of outliers in the top right. Now, do me a favor and just try to keep this in memory as we go through, as well as refer to the handout on this page as we kind of talk through the presentation. Now, the other thing that's important, which I think is a key component to the presentation, is wherever you see that little mini version of the scatter in the bottom right-hand corner, that means that the larger chart on that screen was made from that same set of data. So very important concept as we go through. This is probably the most popular chart type. It's a time-based summary chart showing either the average or the median, depending on which calculation you want to use. Notice how, compared to the left side of the chart, that cluster of outliers is quote-unquote pulling up the overall average. It's an important concept. We'll revisit that in a little bit. But somebody came along and said, how about adding a bunch of other calculations like some percentiles? So the 99th percentile, for example, says 99% of that 3,500 data was equal to or below the 99th percentile. Whatever that number is on the y-axis there. Conversely, that means 1% of that 3,500 data was above the 99th percentile. And so the question then becomes, do the lines tell the whole story? So you might say on the left half of the chart, or maybe the left 3/4 of the chart, they kind of do, where maybe on the right side over here, where I'm missing out on an entire subset of a sample or population, and I'm looking at this. And then when you overlay those percentiles, then maybe now the lines do start to tell the whole story. But how about this one? So, two things. First, pay homage to Dan and his talk last month on heat maps. But the other piece to this whole thing, the other reason that this slide is in here is because we need to kind of understand the general debate when it comes to visuals. And that is, on one side of the coin, there are a group of people that say, present only the data, the dots and the lines, and that will be the best possible way for people to understand the data. However, the other side of the coin suggests that when you do things like make use of color and some of these other infographics, maybe people have heard that word recently, that it stimulates different parts of the brain, thus actually leading to a greater understanding of the data than if you were just presenting only the data. So basically you say chart junk versus no chart junk. At the end of last year, the folks at Harvard published a document. It's called What Makes a Visualization Memorable. And the reason I'm showing this is because we're actually going to talk through and just talk about some strategic use of color. But separately, what makes a visualization memorable? I recommend folks give it a read if you want to take a peek at it. Just to put these side by side, these are all created from the same chart data. And instant poll, if you had to pick one of these four graphs as your default, who would go with number one? Only. So you only pick one. And it's fair to not raise your hand at all and say it just depends, right? But who would go with number two? All right. How about number three? All right, and how about number four? All right, so 2 and 3, right? So the idea there is that we've got a lot of data, we want to present it in some type of summary fashion. So, all right. This is probably the other most popular chart type that folks use. See this in a lot of RUM dashboards, for example. This is a frequency distribution, so the values along the x-axis. And then the number of times response time fell within those values. And those values are actually ranges. One of the problems with this chart is there's not a lot of space to put like 1.1 seconds to 2, 2.1 seconds to 3. So this is like a shortcut that people do. But if you've never actually had this explained to you, you might read it the wrong way. The other problem with this is that it's very tough to kind of see what's going on in those long tails. So that previous chart had no account for that cluster of outliers there, right? Enter now the cumulative distribution, what I have affectionately entitled the hockey stick. Basically what we're doing is we are charting all of the percentiles from the 1st percentile to the 99th percentile, or if you want to trim a little bit from the 5th percentile to the 96th percentile. And here's how we read this chart. 20% of that 3,500 data was 1.6 seconds or below. 40% of that 3,500 test data are 1.9 seconds or below. Who now understands that when we go from like 20% to 40%, that it's a cumulative function, and that when we say the 40%, that it actually includes that previous 20%. So, or said this way, is there anyone who did not kind of understand that? So, congratulations, you all now know what a CDF is. Two things. One, the reason I'm talking about this is because we're going to get to it a little bit. This is by far what I believe to be the most powerful way to do competitive benchmarking. So how do you place along this curve? But two, the other reason why I'm explaining this is because if you go to read the Wikipedia article attempting to explain what a CDF is, you probably will not leave that page knowing what a CDF is. So I'm trying to explain it in a different, more simple way to try to get people to understand how powerful and valuable of an asset this is. Saying it another way, if we were to drop those 3,500 datas into one of those mechanical lottery, machines, you guys know what I'm talking about, we have a 20% chance of pulling a number that is 1.6 seconds or below. We have a 40% chance of pulling a number that is 1.9 seconds or below, and so on and so forth. So that is what a CDF is, and everyone now can go spread the word, because everyone that I've talked to, once we go through, kind of understands and really sees the value of this, right? This is a pretty important slide to kind of make sure everyone understands before we proceed. So is there any questions on this one before we go on, because it's kind of important for the rest of the presentation. Excellent. And I've practiced explaining that slide a few times. So. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you for sitting through that classroom lecture, if you will. I could think of no slide more appropriate than this right here. So young Calvin is looking at Mrs. Wormworth and says, yes, Calvin, my generation does not absorb information this way. Could you please reduce everything to factoids? Turn class to page 21, to which Calvin says, at least our television understands. Right, so now that we've gone through that boring lecture kind of review to normalize, make sure we're all on the same page here, here we go. The raw data easily overwhelms. As a result, we try to present summary, time-based, like averages or medians, or distributions, so non-cumulative or cumulative. The average is more affected by spurious outliers, where the median is less affected by spurious outliers. And one of the most infuriating things I've ever read are a couple of articles that incorrectly say you should use only the median because it's not affected by spurious outliers. To which everyone should respond, that's exactly what you are looking for sometimes. So if you can do nothing else, then just look at both of these calculations and over here where these lines are close together versus where they start to draw apart. That's like a key indicator to kind of, if you can quickly want to look at the data set. That's kind of like the key takeaway from that. All right. Frequency distribution again. Individual bins where the cumulative rolls up. Excellent for seeing the modes. So if we had like another cluster of bars over here, we'd say that's a multimodal. So cash versus no cash, or you're doing a transaction, and one we went through is hotel searches. So this was like cities where rooms were available, and then we had another cluster where rooms were not available. It took much longer to perform those searches, right? So the multimodal. This guy here, excellent for comparing and ranking. This is kind of a big thing for the rest of the presentation. Very important. So there was a gentleman last month who asked the question, at what point do those spurious outliers become not so spurious? And so this is the answer to that question. You want to study where it tapers and turns. So any set of performance data and a frequency distribution generally will have this right skew, and then over here it's going to look like this general shape. The only thing that's going to differ is the point at which it starts to taper and turn. So that's the point at which you start to say, okay, maybe this example is not as bad, but you can start to see that 5–10% of the population, and where it turns is going to differ from case by case, and that's kind of one of the key things we look at when we competitively benchmark. This is what I think of when I think of competitive benchmarks. Do you think you can outrun a bear? No, but I can outrun you. So we don't know who has to be the fastest. You just want to be faster than your competition, right? That's the rule of thumb. True or not, there's some subjectivity there, but this is kind of this is kind of what I dug up and when I was thinking of what to preface this section with. So These charts do not have the scatter. These are actually IR, top 20 retail benchmarks that I've done. Generally, I will do several thousand test runs per, and this is a real simple one where I've taken the median values and just stacked them on top of each other. The fastest at the top. The question is does the color add value? Hold that thought, don't answer it. And there are 20 dots here, and we've got this thing we generally try not to show all the names of the companies that are down here. We think that's bad PR, so we only generally show the fastest. We're now going to take this one-dimensional chart and now plot it on the two-dimension hockey stick. These leader lines I've added are to sort of preserve the 20, 40, 60, 80 percentile, and you generally want to be in the left half of the chart. This is the actual IR aggregate, this 5th to 96 cumulative function for the top IR 20. And yes, believe it or not, so this is going to turn right around at the 84th, 85th percentile. So here it goes sharp and to the right, so that means yes, 15% of the data that we collected is way out here in this range. Instant poll number 2. Who would use the one-dimension chart? Who would use the two-dimension chart? So the two-dimension chart adds another dimension, no pun intended, because you actually get to see the delta from up and down, but also from the left to the right. So just from a visual, internal aspect, it's a very powerful way to look at this. If you have children, you've gone to the pediatrician's office, where do your children fall along the growth curve? Same kind of concept, right? The power of the hockey stick now really starts to, well, I mean, hopefully it already has come to present itself, but when we start to actually now compare full distributions to other full distributions, this is where we really kind of start to see the power of this comparison unleashed. By chance, I happened to pick a site that I know was fast. In this case, I picked Etsy. So this was the full performance distribution, several thousand test runs compared to the IR top 20 aggregate industry average. So there is no question that across the entire distribution, how fast it is. I've got a little turn right here in the 90th plus percentile, but even that percentile is still way below, almost as fast as like over here for the aggregate industry distribution. This is site B. This is what a multimodal distribution looks like in a CDF. So remember the concept of studying where tapers turns? So that means we've got two kind of population sets here because we've got two curves. Clearly an example of a site that is slower when compared to the industry across the full distribution. So these next couple of slides attempts to kind of bring everything all together and are probably the most powerful slides in the entire presentation. Here is the median value of Site E compared to the industry average. I'm sorry, the industry median value. You would look at this if this were just a data table on other websites that publish their benchmark and say, here's the median value of the site compared to the industry, and you say, okay, it's faster. When we compare the full distribution, though, it's not really true, right? So for this percentage, we can say it's a little faster, and then over here it gets slower. And when you compare the area over here compared to the area over here, then the actual, in actuality, it's slower, but it's actually much slower because we're looking at the entire distribution of the data. Now, enter the debate about whether or not this chart is better than the previous chart we were just looking at. So what I've done is just filled the area where red means slower, green means faster, and then I've just labeled it slower than industry, faster than industry. And to me, it just made it a little easier to just say, okay, that area really is larger, because it was just kind of in your face a little bit. So maybe that is a little over the top, and maybe what we do is we just put a little bar down here at the bottom. So green, red, right? Same kind of concept, except you're not really seeing the whole area. And then maybe we don't fill the middle and we just have this. Right? So different ways to skin a cat. And so now, the last instant poll, I promise, one choice only. Who would prefer to use chart number 1? Okay. Who would prefer to use chart number 2? Okay. Who would prefer to use chart number... Yes? This? Oh, that's all right. Who would prefer to use chart number 3? Okay, all right. And who would prefer to use chart number 4? Okay. So the Edward Tufts of the world would be yelling and screaming at me and saying chart number 1 is what I should be using. But you just got to kind of go with your own personal experience and reaction. And so far, if we did a quick frequency distribution, I guess the people in this room picked some combination of 2, 3 versus 1 for sure, and then a little bit of 4. All right. So this sort of kind of wraps up this kind of section of the presentation. And before we kind of proceed, any questions or comments about what we kind of talked through? Because I genuinely believe this is some pretty powerful stuff, and how I think most people should be doing these types of competitive benchmarks. So any questions before we change to a completely section altogether? Yes.
Firstly, what metrics did you use for the competitive benchmarks? Was it start, render, document complete, fully loaded? And also, was it median in all cases as opposed to 95th or mean geometric mean?
So the metric was not the point of the presentation, because it could be whatever metric you prefer. In this case, this was the fully loaded web page response time. So all the style sheets, all the client instructions, all that lazy loaded stuff. I just happen to kind of pick that metric because I think if it's on the page, it should be measured. But it could easily be any metric that you have an interest in measuring. And then the second question, so the distribution, this is the first percentile all the way to the 99th percentile. So the median value would literally be those 2 dots if we were just looking at this chart here.
For one particular.
For one particular. So that's what I'm saying, is when you look at the whole distribution and do the comparison, then you really get an idea of the whole picture, not just one little data point, because people try to kind of skew and tell their own story, which is kind of deceitful and misrepresenting. Sometimes it's not intentional, because it's easy to fall into these traps as we come. So yes, sir. You have a question?
Yeah, a question not so much about the charts themselves, but where'd you get the industry data?
So I get this from Catchpoint. So we have a division dedicated to researching and benchmarking the IR top N number of sites. So I just happen to have it just because of where I work. Mm-hmm. And like I said, how I do this is there'll generally be several thousand test runs per site. So this isn't like a couple of test runs per, because what it does is it makes the curves less smooth a little bit, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
All right. Does the Catchpoint tool right now support cumulative distribution visualization?
So that's actually part of the reason, which I'm getting to, why I'm going around showing this to people, because we take the feedback and determining whether or not to build this into the portal. And it's actually one of the closing slides that I have, so may I ask, hold that thought. Yes, sir.
So are we going to be taking like derivatives of these things and integrals of those areas, or are we going in a different direction?
For the purpose of this presentation, that's a little more than I initially thought. However, if we kind of just glimpse ahead to a bit, what I would say is, so I started writing at WebTortoise a couple of years before I actually started to work at Catchpoint. And the January post of WebTortoise was the hockey stick CDF chart part 1 of 4. So the reason that I actually like this setting is because I genuinely believe, it's a little bit of history here to kind of go and re-explain this to people in a different way and kind of spread the word. But what I would ask is go read that article, because that's part 1 of 4, and part 3 is where I actually talk through and get into the advanced derivatives, as well as like some of the geometric rates of change between the percentiles, and it's going to get pretty deep, but go and take a look and help actually shape the series of posts, and that's actually one of the ulterior motives of coming out and doing these talks to people.
Maybe you're going to get into this, but like how many, is this only A, B, what happens here? It's C, D, right?
You could not do 2, 3, or 4 if there were more than 2 lines on the chart. If was that your question?
Well, yeah. So you basically just want to do 2 lines.
Oh no. That was just a strategic use of only 2 lines, just to kind of include some of the visual elements that go into on top of just regular charting and graphing engines. So if this were the top 20 lines and this were 20 lines, for example, yeah, you definitely would not be able to do the color that way, because it would just be way too messy, which kind of gets back to the point of, show only the data. Yes, sir?
I was just going to say, these actually do kind of give you a sense of the integral. It's like the red and green areas are the differences between the area under the curve. One of them is kind of a negative difference of the other.
Yep. And I saw another hand. Yes.
Yeah, no question. So I'm feeling you kind of lose the time in the day. Because if you measure this for an hour where there's not a lot of traffic, then the curve will look very different than if there's a lot of traffic at that time.
The y-axis is actually percentile values. So again, referring to the scatter, notice how that heat is in those middle hours. So that's actually one of the challenges, is presenting a distribution over a period of time. So the heat map is a great example, and that's kind of why I put that in here, because this is actually, there are 20 blocks here, and so these are the actual percentiles by 5s across the hour of the day. Again, that cluster of outliers on the top right, that's showing up there. Perfect. Yeah, you are absolutely correct, and that's one of the challenges of doing time-based distribution. So, and this is his first time. Maybe Dan could show you some of his stuff. But he actually, we're piggybacking on his presentation a little bit. He actually talked about that in last session. Yeah? All right. Any other questions on this section here? The hockey stick. All right, so everyone now knows what a CDF is. If I were to give you a fair warning, I will tell you that the Wikipedia articles have the axes swapped. I checked with some PhDs, and that is a preference. That is not by definition of what a CDF is. So you are good, and feel free to mention my name if anyone gives you any beef about it. On what day did the change occur? Just a couple of more lighthearted charts to close this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the left half of this chart and chart it over the right half of this chart, resulting in something that looks like this. So check the overlay, to which we say the change occurred Wednesday at 8 a.m. So the overlay, very powerful. Visual, I love it to death, I use it all the time. The reason for the overlay is when you want to check those changes that are not that easy to spot. That's why you might use an overlay. And then this one, this is a trick question. is this showing a performance SLA? I'm sorry, is this showing performance or availability? It is showing neither. It is showing a target and whether or not you met or missed the target. Having said that, I will tell you that so here's that mini scatter, and the SLA in this case was we should deliver 90% of the response times in 3 seconds or less. So general question to the group, I was actually just wondering whether or not I should fill these with red, or whether or not I should put like green bars across here, and then where it didn't meet the target, maybe red bars across here, and then over here green bars again. So questions, comments, reactions? Otherwise, this is a modified bullet chart, and again, it's showing a target and whether or not we met or missed the target. Could be for performance or availability. Yes?
Maybe from a financial standpoint, like red versus black as opposed to red versus green, because black generally means okay.
That's exactly one of the challenges, is the different strokes for different folks. Okay?
I think the whole bar being green.
Yeah, the bar at the top.
The whole thing.
Mhm.
It's above 90, the whole thing should be green.
Okay.
So that would be green, those would be green.
All right. So if you
Or it could be yellow, you know, again.
So if you want to take notes, look up Stephen a few bullet graphs. So this is actually his specification for this chart. So that's where I give credit to in the particular web post, but this is a specification.
And it doesn't make clear it is too, so whichever color.
Does it say, and does the person reading it understand what you're trying to tell them? That's the main point of this.
And a marketing person would look at anything above that 90%, so if it turned from red to green, a marketing person would see it completely different.
And would you say finance, you said?
Yeah, I don't really have a financial background though.
So it's all, like you said, it's all perspective.
All right. Shall we? You know, all the charts in this presentation were made with either Excel or Tableau, and generally I'll do mock-ups for the developers before they spend several hours building this into, code. And that's generally how it works. And so what I'd say to you is, don't be afraid to play with those tools and just click around and see what the hell you come up with. That's how I discovered some of these things before I even knew what they were. Right? We alter what we measure, but if we do not measure performance, then performance will not be measured, right? So sometimes people say if you don't measure performance, you can't improve it or something like that. So I figure if I said it this way, then I'll be mathematically correct regardless. This is an important concept and one of the pain points that I see a lot. So I know of no company that can chart all of these different information, but at least whatever you use, and make sure you can chart, at least several of these different informations, because they all do tell different things and have different use cases. So this is a pretty important one, and gets back to what we were talking about earlier. So the feedback that I look for, talking about the CDF and the hockey stick, is especially as it pertains to competitive benchmarks. That seems to be like the hot thing these days. These types of meetings and meetups are how we go about and determine whether or not, a company like Catchpoint actually builds something. So feel free to comment afterwards and let me know what you think. And then lastly, I always say this one because it just kind of annoys me to no end that people still confuse these two. So availability, are you up or down? Performance, if and only if you are up, how long did you take? So sometimes I see people confuse those. And then we monitor availability, we measure performance. So it's such a simple distinction that people confuse and causes all kinds of problems and unnecessary debates. Otherwise, that is it. Thank you very much for giving me your time.
Any thoughts on how to represent, like you talk about websites, you have 5 different pages and you want to sort of show the stats on 5 different pages. homepage.
That's the
Do you
problem.
identify the graphs or any thoughts on how to better represent that?
That's the problem we're all trying to find the answer to. You know, generally, the people that you ask will tell you because that's the product they're trying to sell. You know, we do benchmarks against real simple pages and benchmarks against real transactions. You know, some of the sites you try to do a purchase or something, they have 10 steps and some sites have 5. I mean, how do you know, I mean, obviously we have some ideas and we try to come up with various indexes and stuff. But I forget who asked, but like which metric,
Right.
which, you
You want
know,
to show them all, right?
I mean, exactly. So it's, you know, what we'll do when we'll publish a benchmark or work on something like that is we'll just do all the metrics. And then other non-performance metrics like count-based metrics like number of requests, number of posts, those are count-based metrics, they're not rate-based. And then just try to take an index overall. But I mean, everyone's got their own way of doing them. So but that's how I would do it. Yes.
Any plans to publish the aggregate performance measurements by industry?
Yes, and I actually publish them on Web Tortoise from time to time, just with Catch-22's permission, of course. And that's actually, one of in the series that I'm writing. In the 4th one, I actually plan to kind of culminate in a big benchmark of the IR top, which is kind of taking these concepts and trying to put it all together. So, absolutely.
The whole distributions or just one metric?
The whole, it should be a pretty hardy document once we get through the post or the series. I feel like there was something I was forgetting, but it'll come as soon as we hang up. But I'll be hanging out. But otherwise, I mean, that was it. I mean, having said all that, it's not the it'll come to me.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Sure, we'll stick around.